Good morning and welcome to another episode of Coffee and Tea with AARP Connecticut, a bi-weekly conversation in which AARP staff and volunteers talk to Connecticut decision makers about policies and programs that are of interest to older residents. My name is John Erlingheuser and I'm the Senior Director of Advocacy and Community Outreach here at AARP in Connecticut. And I'm very pleased to be joined by one of our great AARP Connecticut volunteers, Mr. John Wilson. John, thanks for being with us today. Again, I should say, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you do for AARP and what role you have, and a little bit about your personal background as well?
Sure. I've been a volunteer with AARP for about 3 or 4 years now. I came in here with a technical background, so when I volunteered, I wanted to do something that was technically oriented. So I began to get involved with the Fraud Watch Network. And I volunteer with the Fraud Watch Network here in Connecticut, and usually once or twice a month, I'm someplace in the state of Connecticut educating people about how they can become immune to becoming victims of fraud. I'm also, as John was told you, fairly active in the election and caregiving and Social Security space. And I'm also the AARP state volunteer president, which means if I don't have enough on my plate, there's always more things I can do to help anybody out.
Well, and that's great. And we have such great volunteers here in Connecticut for AARP, and John is indicative of them. And as he said, by all the work that he does, what you find is the volunteers usually come in with one thing in mind and they take a little taste of other things we do at AARP and they decide, hey, I want to work on this and I want to work on that. And that's really great. And I'll just put in a plug for the Fraud Watch Network, which is our probably most popular program and topic that we work on at AARP. So thanks, John, for all you do with that. So today we're going to do something a little bit different for those of you who are accustomed watching AARP's Coffee and Tea program. President Wilson and I are going to be give folks a little bit of an update on our voter education campaign and talk about the changes in voting and voting rules, as well as the statewide ballot initiative and things like that. Because I know earlier in the year they gave both John and Jim O'Brien, one of our great AARP elections volunteers, gave a little bit of a preview of what we were going to be doing this year. So we thought it was good to take a break and now that we're really high speed past Labor Day and into the election season, talk a little bit more about it. So John, tell us a little bit about AARP's voter engagement campaign in general before we talk about some of the nitty gritty.
Sure, John. Voters 50 plus are the majority of voters in every election. They want to see politicians address their day-to-day challenges like caring for their loved ones and protecting their hard-earned Social Security. That's why AARP is fighting for a couple of things. One, to inform voters. AARP provides trusted, up-to-date information on when, where, and how to vote in the 2024 elections so Americans can stay current and make their voices heard. We're also active in every state, giving voters the information they need to cast a ballot. AARP is working to make sure that all voters have the information they need to vote in the 2024 elections.
And that's just so great. I know AARP, we've been providing this kind of information for over 40 years. So I think that's really great that AARP continues to take that on as a mission so voters can make an informed decision. So John, what are the major issues, that AARP is working on to promote this election, particularly at the federal level? What are the major things federally that AARP sees as priorities for its members?
Well, we have two things. One is family caregiving, and the other is Social Security. Specifically on family caregiving, there are more than 48 million family caregivers who assist their older parents, spouses, siblings, grandparents, and other loved ones every day so they can live independently in their homes where they want to be. Add it all up, and that means 1 in 5 voters are caregivers, and they vote, yet they don't get the support they need. It's time to change that. Both parties have a big opportunity to win these voters. Caregivers can make the difference in a close election, and they have in the past. Family caregivers provide over $600 billion, that's billion dollars in unpaid labor each year, saving taxpayers billions and keeping loved ones at home and out of costly nursing homes. AARP is fighting for solutions that will save caregivers time and money and give them more support. On Social Security, if Washington doesn't take action in the next 10 years, Social Security could be cut by 20%. That's an average of $4,000 a year. It's time for both parties to come together and agree on a solution to fix the Social Security shortfall so we can protect the financial security of current and future generations. So this is not just a 50 plus issue. If I had my way, we'd spend a lot of time talking to people in their 30s and in their 40s who don't really know much about Social Security, except that my boss takes some money out of my paycheck for something. AARP is fighting to protect and save Social Security so Americans can get the money they have earned and they've deserved.
John, that bit you mentioned about, fighting for people, with regards to Social Security that are not of age 50 and plus really hits home with me, both on the Social Security front and on the caregiving front. I happen to be somebody who had older parents. I was the youngest of six kids. My father retired at 65. I was a junior in high school. And because I was a dependent of his and he was almost solely reliant on Social Security, got a very small pension. I was a dependent of his. And for the last year and a half that I was in high school, I got a Social Security benefit that my parents, got to help take care of me and the household. And, most people my age at that time didn't understand the importance of Social Security and what it meant to keep people out of poverty. And then when I was in my 30s, before I even become an AARP member, although I was working there, my mother developed Alzheimer's and I was living home with her. And, I was not married and my mother was a widow. And I was an unpaid family caregiver and managed to be able to keep my mother out of a nursing home. And I have to give a plug for AARP, because if it wasn't for working for AARP and how they treat employees in terms of how we care for our loved ones, but also because of all the wealth of information I was able to get about caregiving. So, those are two issues that hit home for me. And you nailed it right on the head when you said this is stuff that's not just about those that are age 50 plus. So, kudos to you and to AARP. So
John, I
yeah,
didn't interrupt you for a second.
no,
You
please.
talk about being a caregiver yourself. Um, I was not a caregiver for my parents because I lived 1,000 miles away when both of my parents suffered with eventually terminal cancer.
Mhm.
And my younger brother was the one that did all that. So he took care of my father for several years. After he passed, he took care of my mother for several years. And I could go out and see them, but I couldn't do anything on a day-to-day basis, which he did. So even though I wasn't a caregiver, I can feel, I can
Yeah.
sympathize for what caregivers go through.
Oh, John, I mean, and before we move on, it's important to say, at some point in your life, you're either going to be a caregiver, going to be cared for, or you're going to know somebody who is a caregiver. And so that's why this is such an important
Mhm.
issue. And that's why people really, from both sides of the aisle, really have to look at this and talk about it, because this is really stuff that hits home and means a lot to a lot of people across the board. So I really appreciate all of that on caregiving. So John, now let's change gears a little bit. So there'll be a major change this election cycle on how people will have the ability to cast their vote. So, and these are changes that AARP has worked on many years to get into place. So, can you tell us a little bit about what is in store for voters when they go to the polls in just a few weeks?
Sure, there are a couple of very important changes that I want everyone to really pay attention to. And before we part ways here, I'm going to give you a website to go to so you can learn more about this. So don't spend all your time writing things down. There's other ways to get this. Up until this election, Connecticut was one of only 4 states that did not allow early in-person voting, which that seemed sort of surprising when I saw that. Now in Connecticut, you can cast your ballots early in person from Monday, October 21st through Sunday, November 3rd from 10 a.m. through 6 p.m., including weekends. Extended voting hours from 8 to 8 will be offered on Tuesday, the 29th of October and Thursday, the 31st of October. Find locations on the Secretary of the State's website or check with your local registrar of voters. Each city and town in Connecticut will have to have at least one early voting location, which will not be a usual election day voting location. In most instances, it will be your town hall. AARP supported this change because we want to give voters every opportunity to exercise their right to vote. This change will particularly help family caregivers who have a great deal of demand on their time, as well as those who work out of state or travel for work.
Wow, that's amazing. And I can just say, I know the AARP volunteers worked very hard on this and got this was a multi-year effort. And you would think about a state like Connecticut that we would be more progressive when it came to voting and people's ability to cast a ballot. And so this is really going to be a great opportunity. I know I'm looking forward to it. And I plan on casting my ballot early just to see how this works in a general election. I took advantage of early voting when it came to the presidential primary. There were 5 days of early voting back in the spring, and I think that system went very, very well. And I was very excited to do it, and I'm looking forward to see how it goes in the general election. So thank you to you, John, and all the AARP volunteers that helped make this a reality and get Connecticut back with the rest of the country, and now get us down to only 3 states that don't have early in-person voting. So that was a whole process, right? I mean, we
Mhm.
passed the constitutional change. The legislature then had the ability to make rules. All of that took place. It took several years. I understand there's another statewide ballot question to change the Constitution in the upcoming election related to elections. So can you tell us a little bit about what the ramifications of a yes and or no vote on that question, and what specifically is the question about?
Sure, let me back up just a second
Yeah,
and
sure.
talk again about early voting. I live in an over 55 community,
Mm,
and I have a neighbor who will be 100 years old
God bless.
in January, and I take her shopping, take her to the doctor. And I asked her a couple weeks ago if she wanted to go to early voting with me so she does not have to stand in a long line at the high school for an hour or however long it takes to vote. Because I want to try early voting too. And she said, well, of course, uh, because that way she and I will go to, and my wife will go to early voting. We'll take care of it in just a few minutes, and I'll have another 100-year-old convert to early voting.
That's great. And people should realize we're just a little bit away from early voting. So
Yes.
make sure you get that information. We'll talk about it a little bit more.
Yeah. Now
So
back to your question
yeah,
about a yes
please.
and a no vote. Connecticut's constitution currently allows absentee voting only if a voter cannot vote in person for reasons such as absence from your city or town on election day, sickness or physical disability, or religious beliefs that prohibit secular activity on election day. Connecticut voters will be asked in this year's election whether the state constitution should be amended to allow all voters to cast their ballots absentee by mail with no excuse. If this ballot measure passes, no excuse absentee voting wouldn't automatically take effect. Rather, passage would grant the General Assembly the ability to pass legislation that would expand mail-in voting to all voters. Lawmakers could choose to raise such a bill during the 2025 legislative session, which begins on January 8th. Now, failure, a no vote, if that's the way the election turned out, would mean that the General Assembly couldn't pass a bill permitting no excuse absentee voting, and we'd be in exactly the same situation right now as we are now with those same rules.
And this took to get this ballot question on the ballot. This took about 5 years. And so voters have the right to decide yes or no. Some people say, whoa, it's the Constitution. Why would we want to change it? We're one of the few states where these types of things are literally spelled out to the letter, like what excuses you could mail in absentee vote is spelled out in the state constitution. So if you want to do away with that, And I think there's about 36 states that currently have no excuse mail-in balloting, which is totally separate from in-person early voting and voting on election day, or currently voting by absentee ballot with an excuse, right? A yes vote. And if we don't want to do anything, if people want to keep the status quo, then they could vote no, and we're right back to where we are. But once we get that yes vote, it would still be incumbent upon the legislature to determine what that mail-in voting looks like. So it's a great opportunity for people to kind of chime in and make their voices be heard on that. So John, you mentioned we have this great resource for folks. Where could people go to get information about all things voting in Connecticut?
Place to go is www.aarp.org/ctvotes. On your screen, you'll see that web address. You'll also see a QR code that you can click on to take you to that site. Now, that site, I want to spend a minute talking about it
Yeah,
because
please.
it's got so much good stuff on there. Um, if you're not registered to vote currently, and you say, well, this is an important election for a lot of reasons, maybe I should register to vote. You will find on that website information about when, where, and how you can register to vote, including on election day. Now, I don't know if I want to stand in line on election day to register to vote. I think I'd probably do that well in advance. In addition to registering to vote, you can learn more about absentee balloting and what you need to do to vote absentee, how, when, where, and so forth. And then early voting. I threw a whole bunch of dates out to you a while ago, and those dates are all on that website. So it doesn't take but 10 minutes to read the website. So go to aarp.org/ctvotes. There may be a question that we haven't answered in there, but we haven't found what it is yet. So I hope that helps you.
That's so great, John. And I'm glad that you spent the time to go in there. And I hope not only our viewers go to that site, but they promote the site to other folks so they can be more in tune to the changes in voting and all the resources that we have with regards to elections. So, John, I appreciate all that information. Before I wrap it up, do you want to add anything else?
Sure. And this comes back to what we do in fraud and everything else.
Yeah.
Everything we do at AARP, one of our slogans is we do it for one, we do it for all. You do not need to be an AARP member to go to that website. You do not need to be an AARP member to call with a question on fraud or to learn information about voting. So if you're not an AARP member and you heard about coffee and tea, go to the website or go to aarp.org/CT and you'll learn a lot more about what we do. So a great resource, for everybody, not just the 50 plus.
Well, John, thank you so much for recording this with us today. And thank you so much for being our great volunteer state president and for all you do with all the different programs that you're involved in at AARP. I also want to thank all of our audience members for tuning in to another episode of Coffee and Tea with AARP Connecticut. Join us again in 2 weeks for another episode and catch back episodes on demand right here on our Facebook page or on our YouTube page. You can scan this QR code to become an e-advocate, and you can also help us advance policies important to those age 50 plus in Connecticut and those beyond and below age 50 plus. So thank you all and have a great rest of your day.